Steven Stayner was taken off the street in 1972 when he was just 7 years old. After living 7 years with a man who kidnapped him, lied to him, and abused him, Steven, along with Timothy White, would break free physically and mentally. Both boys were considered by their families and towns as heroes who saved each other. Steven Stayner would continue his heroism by testifying and facing his victimizer in 2 trials. And even after the trials, Steven would have to face each day in a world that constantly reminded him he was foremost the boy who had been kidnapped. But his life wasn't all tragedy. He would get his GED, get married, and become a loving father who worked hard to provide for his family. This episode, we cover the remainder of Steven Stayner's life. One, more complicated than the kidnapping he's most known for, in the life and kidnapping of Steven Stayner, the hero's legacy. Welcome to this episode of California True Crime. With me are Sean and Charles. How are you two?
I'm good.
Really good.
This is the last episode in our series on Steven Stayner, and our next episodes will be on a new, but not entirely new topic, as Sean will host episodes about Carrie Stayner. Before we get started, I want to thank everyone who has listened and followed these episodes. This was a long series, and I really appreciate people giving it a chance and, of course, listening. I also want to thank Sean and Charles. They've been really amazing and supportive, especially because we hadn't done anything this long before, and it's hard to do something new, so I really want to give everyone and them a big thank you. Information for this last episode came from all sorts of newspaper articles. We'll be adding them to our works cited page on the episode notes. This is ongoing, so it will continue to be expanded. Last episode, we talked mainly about Parnell and told you about the end of his life. This episode, we're going to focus on the victims, so we're going to talk about Timothy White, some information about the families, and of course, Steven Stayner. We'll start this episode with Timothy White. About a year after Timothy White and Steven Stayner escaped Parnell, the White family actually moved to San Jose, California. San Jose is a place we covered it in the San Jose murder episode, and the White family would move to San Jose in about the same time period when it was just morphing into Silicon Valley, so about the same time when we talked about it before. It sounds as if one of Timothy White's parents got a new job, so that precipitated the move. Both Angie and Jim White work in the real estate field. This was a big reason real estate agents in and around Mendocino County were very helpful when Timothy goes missing. They are the initial search crew looking in places they know, houses, abandoned places, because that's their job. Angie White in particular is very thankful for all the help in Mendocino County. But they moved to San Jose, a place in the 1980s that's probably pretty good for people in the real estate field. And they also get a chance to have a fresh start. Pretty quickly, if you remember, after the initial press conferences, the press isn't given much access to Timothy, who by all accounts doesn't experience much trauma and is recovering pretty quickly. But nonetheless, moving to a new place that isn't a constant reminder that he was kidnapped is probably a good thing for him and his family. And this is something I saw when researching trauma, that the younger the victim, and of course, the more quickly the event is over, the better the odds of recovering without as much difficulty, as well as limiting access to the press. So living in a new place where his friends and the townspeople don't exactly know what happened to him, he doesn't get questions all the time. Those are all good things for his recovery.
We've talked about it too before. A lot of that we've kind of pointed to Steven as a big reason why, because he shielded Timothy from a lot of what was going on and made sure that he was taken care of. And then ultimately he's the reason why Timothy was recovered.
Yeah, absolutely. The White family also looks into getting counseling for Timothy. They meet with a few professionals and get information, but they decide to forego having Timothy meet with those professionals. In the San Francisco Examiner, Angie White says that she employed a lot of the information she received from counselors, but Timothy's doing so well, there really isn't a need, so far as they're concerned, for him to meet with anyone. And again, counseling is something that had stigma attached to it even in the 1980s. There's probably plenty of that still in 2019. And any stigma that isn't attached to it, I think, over the last few decades has been at the work of people who've fought against that and come out and talked openly.
And we're not here to judge their choices for their own child and family.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like it was a decision that worked for all of them. Initially, the White family keep in touch with Ukiah and the police in particular. There's a story in 1982, this would be about 2 years after the boys escaped, in the Ukiah Daily Journal, where Timothy comes back to Ukiah to visit, and he actually acts as the bat boy for a Little League team coached by Dick Finn. That's the investigator who hypnotized him.
Mm-hmm.
But as time goes on, they begin to lose touch. The Whites move on, and there truly isn't much about them in articles, which, based on our research, again, is a good thing. They are able to live their life without the press constantly asking for getting into everything that they're doing and all the milestones. And hopefully they get to move on with their life. Timothy and Steven don't stay in touch very long either. They do see each other a few times, including in 1985 when Steven went to watch Timothy playing baseball. He does say, however, that he thinks, this is Steven, the family would rather not have a reminder of what had happened. And Angie White would also say that the age difference between the boys was also a factor in them losing touch.
Going off of that, it just made me think how Steven feels to be a burden even though he's a victim.
Right.
Does that make sense? Like,
yeah.
He helped save him, but he feels like, oh, I shouldn't show up because it'll make him sad or the family sad, even though he's just as much as a victim.
Yeah, but it does fit with what we know of him, too, also thinking about what other people are going through. Yeah.
And probably one of the few people that actually would completely understand what Timothy's dealing with in his own right, that constant reminder of not being able to move on.
Yeah, and there is an age difference. He's in 1985, he's older. So, I mean, him understanding isn't abnormal. Also, at one point, Timothy received $700 from the fund created when Steven went missing. So just like Ukiah gave Steven the $15,000 for saving Timothy from Parnell, the town and the Stayner family feel that Timothy also saved Steven. And I feel like this is really especially true after we've talked about the trials, where Steven talks about the way Timothy kind of made him look differently at his own life and broke through to him. And I think 2 episodes ago, Sean made a good argument why these 2 cases, I mean, you talked about why they aren't separated. They're one case. And I think that has to do how they're seeing it as well. The next time we really see Timothy White in the news is in 2004 when he testifies at Kenneth Parnell's trial in Oakland for trying to buy a child. We mentioned this, as we said last episode. At the trial, he sees Sean Portman and they have that moment together. In 2004, Timothy White is 29 years old and has a wife and 2 children. He lives in Los Angeles, and he and his wife go to Oakland when he's asked to testify in Parnell's trial. The goal being to show the jury what was in store for the child Parnell was trying to buy.
As a reminder that Timothy was that boy at one time.
Right. This is not what Parnell's explanation of trying to have a family and all of that isn't what, they're trying to remind them of what actually was intended. Timothy White was a Los Angeles sheriff's deputy. A good friend of his told the Press Democrat in 2010 that, quote, he went into law enforcement not because of the abduction, but because of his positive interaction with the legal process during Parnell's court hearing. Unfortunately, a lot of the information we have on Timothy's life comes because he passes away in 2010 from a pulmonary embolism after battling pneumonia at only 35 years old. White was known by friends and family as an amazing father and friend. He loved playing softball, boating, and dreamed of attending the Los Angeles Dodgers spring training. Since 2005 until his death in 2010, he worked as a maintenance deputy at Pitch S Detention Center in Castaic, California. White is buried in Newhall in LA County, and like Steven Stayner, people interviewed who knew him felt it was a disservice to remember Timothy White as only a boy who had been kidnapped. He had friends, family, children, and a life dedicated to public service. And apparently, but despite being a Dodgers fan, also had a pretty good curveball and spent a lot of time with his friends on the softball field. A testament to the kind of man Timothy was. A memorial fund was set up in his name after his death to help his family, and a memorial softball tournament played in his honor. Before we talk about Steven Stayner's life, I'm going to talk a bit about some changes to the laws and things happening that both Steven and the Stayner family are a big part of changing. As we said a couple of episodes ago, the kidnapping law changes pretty quickly so that people who are convicted of committing more than one kidnapping of different children in different places will serve their sentences one after each other instead of concurrently like Parnell does. One of the things that happens in California all through the 1980s and 90s, and this isn't just in California, but that's what we talk about here, so we'll focus on that, is a move to strengthen the justice system. This happens for a variety of reasons. People begin to feel very unsafe. We've talked about the stranger danger program and things like that as a response to a perceived danger of kidnapping or other crimes. Crime rates during this time don't actually really change, and in some years it actually goes down this happens before any new proposals are passed. But what does change is the medium landscape. When Steven first comes home, and we have different feelings on this topic, there's a lot of press everywhere. But there isn't the press as we know it now. It's all just beginning in 1980. Large media conglomerates with 24-hour coverage don't just exist. But once they do, better technology and a desire among readers to hear about information quickly and information from all over the country and the world becomes the norm. So it's less that there's more crime and more that people are hearing about crimes for the first time. You're hearing about everything that's happening. The other thing that happens is in California, there are several high-profile cases involving murder and kidnapping that affect how people view the world around them. Polly Klaas is a good example, and Kimber Reynolds is another. These are just two cases, but they are highly covered, and the murders of each are committed by men who it turns out have long, violent histories. This, coupled with Kenneth Parnell's small sentence, really makes people angry, and they begin to feel as if the justice system is letting them down. There's also, not just in California, but around the country, as we said, a focus on certain kinds of crimes. We talked about this before, but things like the internet eventually make us feel like crime is everywhere, when really it's the mode that's changed. It hasn't gone up per se. At this time, crimes like drugs, gangs, and carjackings, these are all really heavily covered in articles about California's laws, and they're at the forefront, they become at the forefront, really, of what people start to worry about.
Do you think that's because these are the crimes that people are seeing most often in their own communities?
I think that could be the case. Yes, I do think as more people have cars, things like carjackings go up in the 80s and 90s. I also think that they're hearing about things happening in other places. And when you're in California, you hear about stuff happening in other places of California, and you're hearing about it all the time. It just kind of makes you start to worry, despite the fact that the statistics show there isn't more crime and there isn't more murders or kidnappings. And we've heard this, I think, over the last few months when we've mentioned doing this series of podcasts on Steven Stayner. We've had people talk to us about how terrible that is, and also, isn't it awful you can't take your kids to the park anymore? And we don't really know what they're talking about. But I think there are these ideas about what's unsafe, despite the fact that there's not a lot of statistical evidence to back that up. In response to this worry, legislators react by creating and trying to change the legal system, with an eye on finding a way to be more fair as well as protect the public. And Parnell is a good example of this. His sentence for the crimes he's committed is ridiculous, and the goal is to rectify this. And all of the polls for a good 20 years really have citizens of California saying their number one overwhelming concern is criminal justice reform. In 1992 and 1994 alone, the number of bills sent to the Legislative Criminal Justice Committee in California is double what they would usually get. More crime legislation is passed in 1994 than in any other year of the previous 20 years. And most of these bills don't go into effect until after 1994. But in the first half of 1994, crime is already down 7.5%. So that's before any of these measures really go into effect.
So it's legislators reacting to the call, like the will of the people, without actually looking at crime statistics or actual facts? Is it like just knee-jerk reaction?
Well, I would say it's hard. It's more difficult than that because there is some of that. I mean, A, that is part of what a legislator's job is to do, they're representing people. But B, the other thing is there are these really important cases people can point to. Parnell is one of them.
Right.
Polly Klaas is another, where people have been through the justice system many, many times, and they get out and they commit terrible, terrible crimes. And people are afraid. Does their fear match statistics? Maybe not, but that doesn't change the fact that they want to be able to protect their kids and stop things from happening that could lead again to those same instances. And they want to keep someone like Parnell off the streets.
It's not a good answer for the people that have fallen victim to these loopholes or short sentences, or people that have gone into the quote unquote revolving door of justice.
But some of it is, like you're saying, people are upset about things that don't have a lot of statistical backing to them. It was kind of like when MH370 went missing, and CNN, I watched it for days. CNN covered it. Yeah, the plane, I'm sorry. And I watched it for days. And then CNN got a lot of coverage and got a lot of people watching, so they started covering anything that happened with a plane. And I started to feel like, what's happening with the air system?
Oh, that happens so much. I think I brought it up in a different episode already, how it's like when we're a hurricane, and then the news will cover a breeze because it's just like, that's the news of the day.
Right. Or recent, like anything around that's not even close to the hurricane's path. You know, how is that affecting you? Or it's almost trying to drum up more drama.
Yeah.
But I think we're now in a spot where at least it's the news portion of this, television news specifically, it's more entertainment than it is an actual news source.
But it makes people feel emotionally a certain way. And a lot of that is happening for the first time in the 80s and 90s, when 24-hour news becomes a thing and people are reacting to the stuff that they're actually seeing. So there's varied laws. It's not just one law they passed. There's laws trying to attack this issue from different aspects. We'll go through some of them and to really try and make a difference. And I think we've seen this throughout, eventually when we do more episodes as well, kind of criminal justice reform ebb and flow. You want to stop things from happening when you hear about them, and then those laws sometimes go too far, so we have to fix them, and it kind of goes back and forth.
That's somewhat of the point of our legal system, is the fact that it's malleable, and it should be looked at periodically to make sure that it's erring on the side of justice and not.
Right. But this is the world. I want to give a good idea of the world that the Stayners and Steven Stayner in particular, after he comes home, are living in and working in, because he'll work to change some of these laws.
Going back to that stat of 7.5% down in 1994, did they give any reason why they might have thought crime went down?
I didn't see one, and I didn't look up more specifically for that stat. So I'm not sure exactly why. There were stats throughout the years. Sometimes they went down, sometimes they went up. It could be.
Right.
Well, 93, early 90s, there's, a boom in the economy.
Yeah.
We're starting at the very, very, very cusp of kind of the Silicon Revolution in California.
But also, to me, what made me think of it is 1994 was a huge thing for amazing music, great movies, a lot of things that might have made people happier. I don't know.
Pop culture's making people, yeah.
You never know.
I'd buy that.
So one of the bills passed during this time was called the Truth in Sentencing Bill. This bill is directly written in response to Parnell's short sentence that is only shortened when he's given time off for good behavior and also for working in jail. Earning this time is deemed important because it gives prisoners an incentive to be doing the right things in jail. In theory, bettering themselves, taking classes, being on good behavior, that all helps both them and the jail run more smoothly. The problem is that there isn't really a limit before this bill to how much time can be earned. So Parnell, who most people believe is a danger to society, and in particular children, he earns quite a bit of time off. So a bill is written that still allows people to earn time off, but specifies that a prisoner must also serve 85% of their jail time. They can only earn so much. This bill is signed by Governor Pete Wilson. In 1985, Assemblyman Gray Davis writes the Missing Children's Act. This act will increase the penalties of kidnapping, which are before this act 3, 5, or 7 years, to now be 5, 7, or 9 years. It also set the penalty for the crime of kidnapping to commit rape, molestation, or other sex crimes as life without the possibility of parole. In California, crimes that carry a possible life without the possibility of parole also do not have statute of limitations. So this is a bill that, in theory, if it's passed, would change a lot of things. Kay Stayner, she'll go to the Assembly in 1985 and testify before the California State Assembly Public Safety Committee about her experience, and what Steven went through. She's hoping they'll pass this new law. a big part of this is that people start to feel that the larger penalties for kidnapping. So at this time, we talked about one of the largest penalties for kidnapping was ransom. And that's actually passed because there are a lot of kidnappings for ransom in the beginning of like the 1900s, both in California and around the country. So Kay Stayner in particular and other legislators believe that this law puts a premium on people's belongings, the money they would give for the ransom, rather than their loved ones, because that carries a higher penalty than does stealing Steven, for instance. This law gets passed eventually, also with another bill at the same time called the King Bill. It's a very similar bill, and they're both signed. They do not put kidnapping in the goal of committing a sex crime at life without parole. So that doesn't actually pass. It's life with the possibility of parole, and those still carry statutes of limitation. And also, you obviously still, in this case, which I think might be difficult, have to prove that that was the reason the person was kidnapping the child. There are other bills not necessarily associated with the Stayner kidnapping that are passed. Some of them the Stayners talk about and work towards, and Steven does as well. A bill to keep prisoners from profiting off their crime in jail, for instance. The money that they make is supposed to go to victims. So if they work in jail, that money can go to victims. Also, if they write a book or make art and that kind of stuff, all of that money they were able to keep. And people think that for good reason is wrong.
Collectively, these laws are called Son of Sam laws because of the law enacted to make sure that David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, didn't profit off his story and crimes. But this law in California was struck down in 2002 because of a lawsuit brought by Barry Keenan, who is a person who kidnapped Frank Sinatra Jr. when Frank Sinatra Jr. was a child in the 60s.
That's interesting. Why was it overturned?
It seems that the laws, our particular law in California, and then it's also been done in a few other states, it's been overturned by Supreme Courts because of violating free speech and that being sacrosanct.
Oh, okay.
Interesting.
The Stayners, including Steven, also participate in other things aimed at helping to protect children. Big movements to fingerprint kids, which some people may remember. I know that was a big deal when we were younger. They start picking up steam in schools, and counties are behind this. In Mendocino, for instance, they work to fingerprint all the children in the area. And it isn't mandatory, but organizations come in and parents get, I don't know if you guys remember the little board. You get like a piece of board and it would have your fingerprint on it. And then your parents would keep it in case something happened to you down the line.
I actually remember doing that, doing it as a kid. I think I was maybe 4 or 5. I have a distinct memory of my mom bringing me in, and they had like the table set up. And there was like law enforcement and local volunteers, and there was a bunch of us around, and then taking a little board home.
I don't know what kids do now.
Yeah, I don't remember any of that.
Probably something with technology, maybe. I don't know.
I just remember the hearing test.
Well, I don't. Yeah. Do parents fingerprint their kids anymore?
I don't know. It might not be as necessary now that we have DNA and things like that to match kids. The family also worked with other families of missing children. I believe they did this both while Steven was missing and when he gets home. Steven also starts to work as he gets older directly with organizations that spring up because other children go missing. He will go into schools and talk about his experience, hoping to help just even one child. This leads us to Steven's life. His life is a little bit different than Timothy White's. Once 1983 starts and the trials are mainly over, we talked about how the Stayner family, they begin to get back to their lives. They're going to try not to pay as much attention. However, they aren't entirely left alone. Anytime a new law is passed or a kidnapping is committed, or sometimes another crime that involves, a similar thing, or maybe involves Parnell or someone similar to him, or just a crime with a lot of notoriety, it all gets brought back out. So they don't seem to quite have the same quiet that the White family might have gotten. The other thing is that Steven was older when he was taken and when he was found. He was also missing for a lot longer and suffered abuse, so it's a little more difficult for him, if not impossible, to settle back into his own life. Steven does not receive treatment from a professional to help deal with his time that he's kidnapped and abused. In later life, he does say that he talks with someone at his church, and he'll also say that talking and doing interviews with news is a sort of way he deals with his past trauma. There is a lot made, as we said before, of his not receiving help. Several counselors and psychologists offer to help Steven for free, I think. And as time goes on, stories in the paper begin to point a little more angrily. We talked about the quote being misused. But stories actually start kind of appearing, and they point to his parents, and in particular his father, as reasons he never receives help, that it was sort of forbidden. Some of this actually comes from a source that I question. We haven't talked about this person yet, but we will in a little bit, so we'll save that for then. But Steven always says that not getting outside help was his choice. And he and others who knew him will say that he really didn't talk about his time with Parnell, with them, the people he was closest to, and especially the abuse with anyone. And knowing the area and the time period, I don't know how unusual this is. It's a big case, so everyone's kind of weighing in on it. But I don't know that people not getting help isn't something that happens quite often. And I have to wonder, out here in the Central Valley, I mean, he's offered help, but if this were to happen to you, especially back then, but even now, how much specific people who know what they're doing and who've done this before with other people who've been kidnapped or who had abuse are easily available to everyone.
Yeah, it would be different, I imagine, getting help from somebody who specializes in childhood trauma or helping victims of sexual abuse versus doctors or psychiatrists, well-being they may be, not necessarily understanding the problem as well.
And I would think there are a lot of places around the United States where finding a doctor is difficult, which means finding this kind of professional help might be difficult as well and affordable for everyone.
Right.
There's also other issues, the stigma attached with seeking help and even openly speaking about sex abuse. Last episode, we talked about some of the ways stereotypes about perpetrators make their way into the same for victims, that someone wanted it, that they might become abusers themselves, that if you're abused by a man in this case, it can make you gay, some of that stuff. Then there's the distrust of the mental health system. There's stigma now with the mental health system, and it's largely better because of how much work people have put into making it better. So in the 1980s, there's even more stigma attached to that. And then you factor that this case is so public. So him going to see someone will be public. I can understand being kind of wary of that.
Yeah, on top of which, and I know Parnell was found guilty, but part of his defense was Steven wanted to be with Parnell. So that people read those stories, those, like you said, those rumors are circulating out there.
The fear of them hearing you're also getting help might...
Right.
Yeah. And it wouldn't be unusual, I don't think, for the entire family to have needed some help with a counselor or psychologist, having gone through this. My mom used to have a saying when we were growing up that if one person in a family experiences trauma, it happens to all of us. We all experience it. We may experience it in different ways, but it affects us and we have to deal with that. And I think that might be true for any families who go through this. There's different kinds of trauma. Obviously, Steven is the worst, I guess the worst if you want to put it on a scale, but everyone needs to kind of learn to deal with what happened.
And really come together back as a family, figure out how they function as a family, their new family, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
I think with all the people that are involved, because I don't think it just ends with the family. It's such a ripple effect because, like, for example, when he's found, and then his girlfriend is just like left behind in Mendocino County. So, she could use counseling.
Right.
I think it's just, there's a lot of people affected.
Steven will eventually go back to school, and if being in high school weren't difficult enough, he has the pressure of also being known by everyone and having his life in great detail out for his classmates' consumption. His mother describes his experience in school as, quote, he blends in, he tries desperate to blend in. A lot of people ask questions and so on. He's not too crazy about it. And I don't think it's just the knowledge of what happened to him, the sexual abuse, but it's just the constant of him always being the boy who was kidnapped.
It's almost like having a celebrity in school.
Yeah.
Except in this case, it's being a celebrity for the worst possible reason.
In many ways, Steven's time in high school sounds a lot like you might expect. He works part-time at Wendy's, he likes playing video games, watching movies, hanging out with friends. He doesn't get very good grades, but that's not unusual for a lot of kids. And in the papers, his family says that he has trouble living a life with rules and chores. That comes up quite a bit, that he has trouble going back to his old life in a way, or adjusting back to that same life. What the papers don't talk very much about, though, is the trauma he suffered. And for sure, there is an aspect of someone getting used to living another kind of life. But he's also experienced a trauma, and he's had that happen during very important formative years. These are years kids learn how to handle emotions. And when you experience trauma, but you haven't yet learned how to deal appropriately with sadness or anger, then it becomes very overwhelming. And asking a child to do well in school, to do some math problems, in the middle of this can be a recipe for explosiveness. And lots of children will exhibit anger or extreme sadness, frustration that doesn't match maybe what you're doing. It comes out of nowhere because the smallest thing can remind them of their trauma, and nothing can remind them, and it just comes back. And some kids can become the opposite, silent or unable to interact. Trauma, as the judge in Steven's trial said, is a wound to the brain. And people can't see it, so they forget that it's there. But as adults, we wouldn't get mad or unhappy with kids who broke their arm and then couldn't do things. We'd understand. This is a debilitating wound, and it's just in a place you can't see, and it takes time and rehabilitative help. The other things children don't have, because they're still learning this, and truthfully, a lot of adults have difficult time with this as well, is language. People build the vocabulary to describe their emotions and to recognize these emotions over time, usually over childhood. So a child who's experienced trauma may be unable to fully explain or describe. They might not even recognize it. Because having the language, the skills to share the trauma is a learned behavior, and they're still working on that. And if adults have difficulty doing all of these things, imagine how hard it is for Steven, in high school. And for Steven, there are things that will set this off, because the pressures of trying to be some person you haven't even figured out yet, while also not being the old person you were, but have always had expectations for, has to be really tough. So an example of this is one Christmas, Delbert is talking about cherry candies he really likes. They don't give the name, but I think they're talking about cordial cherries. And it turns out that this was also one of Parnell's favorite candies. So Steven tells Delbert that he tells him that they were Parnell's favorite and that they can't be his favorite anymore, because the smallest thing like that is a reminder of the trauma he went through, and it comes back into his brain and it affects him. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, children who experience trauma, and this is actually off their website, so we'll put that up on our site, can have difficulty sleeping, changes in eating habits, and clinginess. They may also have difficulty with trust. They may experience the traumatic event again through things like nightmares, even in their play with friends. They often avoid anything that reminds them of the trauma. They can also experience a lack of emotions or feelings about the event. They can be jumpy or scared, and they sometimes live in constant fear that will happen again. Children who've experienced trauma can also suffer from PTSD. This is defined, according to the Mayo Clinic, as a mental health condition triggered by a terrifying event. And this event doesn't need to be as prolonged as what Steven experiences it for it to affect people's lives. Symptoms of PTSD can include flashbacks, thoughts you can't control, and come on also without control. It can also include negative thoughts about yourself or others, hopelessness, difficulty with memory or focusing, difficulty maintaining relationships, feeling emotionally numb, as we said. And there are many symptoms associated with PTSD, so we will link that page to our episode notes as well. Most importantly, if you think you or someone you know is suffering from any of these, then talking to a doctor or professional is important. And for the rest of us who aren't experiencing these things, being understanding and patient and supportive of people who are is really important. We'll also link the website to the PTSD Alliance. They're at ptsdalliance.org, and they have a page dedicated to ideas and explanations for people who want to help a loved one with PTSD. Because we've mainly focused on Steven, but when you're a loved one of someone who's going through a traumatic event or PTSD, it can be really difficult for you as well. And the Stayner family, or really any family who've lost a loved one, or with a loved one who's experienced trauma, will need help dealing with this new part of their life too. As we said, these are things most of us don't know how to do because we've never dealt with them before. So I'm really happy there are resources that are available for us that weren't there for the Stayners. So if you remember, Steven brought his dog Queenie home to live with him in Merced. And at some point, he also goes to Mendocino and gets his pet goat Annie from the Manchester Ranch, as well as a few other things that he had there. And he brings that all home with him to Merced.
They're still at the home on Betty Street right now?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay.
In his belongings that he brings home, there's a mitt with his old name on it, Dennis Parnell. There's also a map that he created by tracing from an atlas. It shows a path from Manchester to Ukiah to a city named Williams and then to Merced. So it kind of shows he was thinking about his family and maybe coming home during those 7 years. It also shows that he's kind of a person torn. And a reporter from the Merced Sun-Star who's interviewed him a bunch through the years will talk about this, that he seems like someone who's trying not to be Dennis Parnell, but that's a huge part. That's 7 years of his life.
And it's this, like you said earlier, it's the 7 years that are some of the most formative for a child. It's it's kind of that transitional period between being a child and being an adolescent and growing up and getting independent. And
I think it's hard because it depends how you look at it. I think when we hear Dennis Parnell, we think about all the things he went through, and we think of him as a kidnapped child. Mm-hmm. For Steven, that's true, but Dennis Parnell is also the person who liked comic books and movies and had friends. I mean, those are real things that are a part of his personality and who he is. And so to try and just pretend that person doesn't exist, to be someone new, is probably impossible.
Yeah, it's I guess an analogy you could use is it's for a lot of people. They have two sides of their personality. You have the public side and the private side. But in this case, he really does have two separate, complete people. He has the person that he was as Dennis, the person he grew into that was a survivor, that found ways to cope with the horror that he was experiencing. And then you have Steven, whose life was cut off at 7 and then started again at 14.
Yeah, I think it's less about a name and more about just accepting that you are a person who experienced good things.
Right.
You had friends, you went to ball games, and that person still exists. And it doesn't change because people are focused on the bad part of that and just learning to live with it.
If you're looking for something different, Murder Mile covers the untold, unsolved, and long-forgotten murders in London's West End. It's researched using the original police investigation files, it's presented as a dramatisation, and it focuses on the victims' lives in an honest, detailed, and sympathetic way. Murder Mile is about life, not lunatics. So if you love true crime stories about real murders by regular people in everyday places, then Murder Mile is just for you. Murder Mile was nominated one of the best British true crime podcasts of 2018. So if you love things a little bit different, try Murder Mile.
As high school goes on, he still has a lot of difficulties. At one point after coming home, his parents actually get a divorce. Steven will say this is one of the most difficult things he goes through. I couldn't find any information on the relationships of couples or parents of children who go missing, probably because specifically stranger kidnappings, they just don't happen very often. So I looked at research involving divorce rates among couples whose children had passed away, and what I found was actually surprising. According to a group called Open to Hope, which deals specifically with helping families who have lost a child, the divorce rate isn't actually any higher among people who suffer that trauma, which is something I had just always heard and always assumed was true.
Yeah, me too.
So I guess in 1977, according to this site, Harriet Schiff, who's a woman, she wrote a book called The Bereaved Parent. And in it, she said that 90% of grieving couples have marital problems after losing a child. The website Open to Hope says she doesn't actually cite a source for this information, which is not to say that her books are bad. This website still she has several books on bereavement, and this website still uses her books, as do other people. But they say that this site from the book in particular is not correct, and that this led people to believe that it was just a truth, and it's actually a myth that's permeated, I guess, a lot of our consciousness. Obviously, everything the Stayner family goes through causes a ton of stress for the family. But if we draw the comparison from families who experienced a loss, then the divorce rate is about the same as couples who didn't experience a loss. And I only go for this because I don't want anyone to think that if they have a kid or child who suffers a trauma or who is kidnapped, unfortunately, that their marriage is doomed. For Steven, the breakup of his parents was very difficult. After a few years, once he's out of high school, Kay and Delbert Stayner, they do get back together. I don't have an exact year, but I think it's sometime before 1989. Steven leaves high school before graduating. He leaves during his senior year. His time in school is difficult. His mother will say that he's being asked about the kidnapping all the time. And he also suffers intense bullying. He gets in a fight when a boy in school, this is just an example, bullies him with information about his life with Parnell. Kay Stayner says the boy read that information in the newspaper. And there are many obstacles victims of abuse work through. We've talked a lot about those, anxiety, PTSD, but there are also external obstacles. We've also talked about a few of those, the press, all the attention, the law and the trials. But the one we haven't talked about, and the one that's a very big issue, is bullying. And this is something Steven suffers pretty intensely. And this is an important topic for me. We haven't talked very much about who we are or what we've done, but I've worked with both sides of this issue, both kids who've experienced sex abuse and kids who've committed sex crimes. And one of the things I saw over and over was terror from kids afraid of people, particularly their peers, finding out. And we've talked about this a little bit. The three of us don't know how to stop all the horrible things in the world, but when the horrible things are worsened because of something society is doing, that does seem like something we can work to stop, and bullying to me fits into that category. So the bullying that I saw was in particular focused on the victim, and mainly them being responsible for their own, for the sex crimes committed against them, or even liking it. And a lot of bullying about how that sex crime made you gay. And this is now, not in 1980 when Steven experiences these things. And we know the world Steven lives in because we've talked about it a lot. We've covered how people treat abuse and people who are gay in the 30s and 40s and 50s. We've talked about the world in the 80s with Anita Bryant and people still making this connection. And I know in 2019, kids still get bullied for the abuse someone has inflicted on them, making it seem like it's their own choice, and it's still connected a lot to this idea of being gay. I tried to find specific stats that deal with children who suffer abuse and then bullying, and I was really unable to find specific stats about that. And not just statistics about how often it happens, but statistics about what it looks like, explanations of the words that are used when kids who've experienced sexual abuse are bullied, the kinds of things other children or even adults say to them. And I couldn't find a lot of that when I went looking for it. So what I'm going to do is give stats instead for bullying in general. From the National Bullying Prevention Center at pacer.org, 1 out of every 5 students reports being bullied. Bullying can be words, it can be physical, it can also include social media and the internet. And the most common things kids are bullied about are appearance, race and ethnicity, gender, a disability, and sexual orientation. And the effects of bullying are awful on everyone involved. For the victims, it can lead to anxiety, depression, a feeling of low self-worth, an inability to focus at school, difficulty with sleeping, eating, a higher risk for alcohol and drug use, something that Steven does unfortunately struggle with through most of his life. And they are also at higher risk for mental health issues. But what's interesting is that bullies are also at higher risk for all of these things, as are bystanders. So bullying is sort of just bad for everyone. But there are 2 statistics that really stood out to me when looking at this site. The first is that, according to Pacer, more than half of bullying situations stop when a peer intervenes on behalf of the student being bullied. And the second are that school-based bullying prevention programs decrease bullying up to 25%, which means if a lot of kids who suffer physical abuse are being bullied, then one of the things we can do is educate people who haven't had that experience but do interact with kids who experience that. So based on that, I tried to look up places on the internet or places people could find resources for helping parents talk to their kids. And I found a lot of resources for helping parents talk to their kids when their children have been victimized by a pedophile or someone who's committed a sex crime. What I didn't find were a lot of resources on how parents can talk to their children who, based on our own research, have probably already come into contact with someone who has been a victim themselves. So your child hasn't had this happen to you, but they may be in a classroom with someone who has. And there's not a lot out there that I could find for how to discuss that with them, how to treat other kids, the kinds of things that they might come up, bullying, for instance, and how they should handle that.
Even inadvertently. I mean, a student that would be in this case, in Steven's class, might not know that what they were doing is hurting Steven. So a way to talk to that student and say, or talk to that child and say, here's, in an age-appropriate way, here's what happened to your friend. Here's what we can do to help make this better in some small way.
Because it can be the littlest thing, as we
Right.
just talked about. I mean, the candies kind of made him think of his experience. So those things could come up all day long. So it's good to be able to talk to an adult, a teacher, and have people kind of understand how they're supposed to handle it. But also, kids are going to experience that.
Well, also the statistic you mentioned that bullying is significantly decreased when a peer steps in.
Right.
Not necessarily when an adult steps in, but when a peer steps in.
By half.
And that's amazing to me. So even educating kids in that respect as well, if you see this happening, take a stand against it.
And for me, I think we've talked a lot about, we kind of covered the history and how understanding sex abuse is for us a relatively new thing historically. So this is just kind of taking it farther because I think there's a deficit in understanding how even adults are supposed to act. I don't know how many stories we hear where sex abuse has gone on with the gymnast, for instance, or other stories where kids have told adults. Some adults have been told several times by other kids that this is happening and nothing is done. And it's maddening, but maybe a better way is to come up with ideas and systems and resources people can go to and that will tell them this is what you're supposed to do. Here's how we can help. Because I think people are afraid of maybe calling 911 or CPS or somebody, getting someone in trouble when nothing's happened, or just they're not sure what to believe. And there just aren't a lot of resources for the rest of us who haven't been abused to deal with people who have. And if we have those resources, then like you said, we can step in when we need to, and we can do it in an appropriate way that doesn't make it worse.
But really, that simple idea of saying, listen, really listen to what somebody is telling you. I think every time, again, using the relatively recent case of the gymnasts and the doctor, those people, those women had told people, but were shot down or pushed off or whatever. And then when you hear on the news it's being reported and look at how terrible this is and when will this stuff stop? When will people listen to the actual victims? I think that's what outraged myself when I listened to it. You knew this was going on.
I think people really work well when there's steps they can follow. Right. And if those steps don't currently exist for
then need
how
to be put in place.
Right. And if bullying is terrible, not just for the person who's bullied, but clearly if they're going through all this too, if you're a bully or you know a bully, they're at risk of all of these things we talked about with the bullying and bystanders as well, then something more has to be done. And if it's coming up with ways to do it, that's better than doing nothing.
And there's something we said too for the person that's doing the bullying, because that's a whole nother can of worms that could be looked at, and what's causing that child or young person to go through that cycle of violence or cycle of they're putting their abuse on somebody else in a lot of cases that they've been victims themselves, and this is the way that they're expressing it. That's not true for every bully,
right?
Obviously,
well, and all kids are different, but right. Steven suffers so much. We've covered that. And the thing that forces him to leave school ultimately is bullying. And that's really heartbreaking. After leaving high school, Steven worked to get his GED. He went through a lot of stuff as he got older, a lot of it really normal, except in his case, it's all being covered by the news. So an example that probably people have heard, because I've heard it a bunch of times, he racks up like $1,100 in tickets for his car that he worked off. But that's all, it gets played everywhere in the news. And that's just sometimes it's just normal kid stuff.
Well, yeah, had it been anyone else, it would have been some dumb anecdote you'd tell at a party or some, my friend got $1,100 in parking tickets or speeding tickets or whatever. But the simple fact that it's Steven Stayner, the boy who was kidnapped, that has $1,100 in tickets.
At 20 years old, Steven marries his girlfriend Jody. She was 17, and they married in Atwater in an apartment recreation hall there. Atwater is about 8.5 miles from Merced, and we talked a little bit about it in our second episode in this series. It's still in Merced County. It's a smaller city than Merced. In 2017, it only had about 27,000 people living in it. And Charles, you talked about how it had Castle Air Force Base there. And Steven and Jody, when they moved to Atwater, they actually live really close to Castle Air Force Base. Steven says the move to Atwater was really good, even though it's just a short move. According to him, he says, quote, "In this town, we can walk down the street without having to worry." I think he gets asked less questions and less focus. When they moved to Atwater, as I said, they live in a mobile home. They live with some family right next to Castle Air Force Base. And the two of them work at KFC and eventually enroll in their manager training program. They both have hopes that they can open and own their own franchise in the future. While living near Castle, the two also welcomed their first child in 1986 and a second one in 1987. And it sounds as if Steven is pretty close with his family, including his parents and sisters, but he doesn't really have a close relationship with his older brother, Carrie. And it's something he regrets. He says that when he gets home, his brother is 18 years old and he's basically ready to move out and get on with his life. And that's kind of when he gets home. And so they never really develop a close friendship or brotherhood. While finding a quiet life in Atwater, one of the things that didn't change was interest in Steven's life from the outside. When Steven first came home, the family seemed really interested, if you remember, in selling their story to Hollywood. On that first day, it seemed like a good idea and a way to bring hope to others who are missing kids. But as time goes on and journalists and the news are in their life, Kay and Delbert become less willing to sell the story. And they have a lot of people asking, actually. There are people who want to do movies, TV, miniseries, and there are even book offers. In an interview with the Associated Press, Kay says that, quote, "We've had to sell our story to protect ourselves. It doesn't make a lot of sense." By the time they sell the story, the family basically wants the attention and press to go away. But they're told that there are several unauthorized projects in the works. So if they want to have a say in how their story is told, they're basically forced to sell the rights. Those other projects can still go forward as far as I know, but at least there will be something out there that they've had a hand in. It's at least some of the truth, and people might watch that as well. They sell their rights to the story to a production company called Jaffe Productions, which I believe was run by Stanley Jaffe. Stanley Jaffe is a pretty big producer. He worked with Paramount, and he had kind of just opened his production company. He produced movies like Fatal Attraction and The Bad News Bears.
And that's the original Bad News Bears, correct?
Yes, yeah. The deal the Stayners make with Jaffe Production includes a clause that gives them script approval, and it also kept their compensation for selling the rights a secret. The White family also signs a contract with Jaffe Productions for their part of the story. This project, however, never really gets off the ground. And through the years in the 80s, it sounds like there are several projects which people come to them and they start to get going, but they never really make it to the end. Sometime during the years, the Stayner family come into contact with a man named Mike Eccles. We mentioned him briefly last episode. Eccles is responsible for providing material for the movie I Know My First Name is Steven, which aired on Tuesday, May 22nd, 1989 on NBC, and it played from 9 to 11 p.m. So when I first started researching this episode, I actually started with just a quick Google search, and one of the articles I came upon was called, quote, "Inside the Monster." And this is an article written by a woman named Katie St. Clair and was in the East Bay Express. It was also originally published on September 15th, 2000. The writer of the article, which we'll link for everyone, lived in Berkeley during the time that Parnell lived there and became interested in interviewing him. The thought of someone like Parnell living in her town and I think she finds out she drives by his house. She became kind of interested and fascinated by him. So one of the first steps that she takes before contacting Parnell was finding and contacting Mike Eccles. I didn't know anything about Eccles prior to doing this research or reading this article, but her interactions with him just sort of made me feel uncomfortable. In her article, she says that upon contacting Eccles, he told her, quote, "Parnell loves to talk to the press and will go on and on about all the disgusting things he likes to do with little boys. All he asks in return is a carton of Pall Malls." Now, I know these are two professionals talking to each other, and I don't know either of them, and I'm not there. It's just an article I'm reading, but that quote just really, it bothered me. And then later in this story, you find out she goes and talks to Parnell's appeals attorney, who's an attorney he hasn't had before. And he says that he's interested in meeting Steven Stayner, and Mike Eccles actually brings Steven to his office to introduce them. And I found that really odd, because I don't know why Eccles would need to introduce Steven to Parnell's appeals attorney. And it just bothered me. So also in an article before the movie comes out, Steven is interviewed in the Press Democrat, and he says someone is writing a book about his life. He's read the first 3 chapters, and, quote, "He, meaning the author, made it look like the whole 7 years were nothing but terror. I had good times. I got into trouble in school. I was real rowdy, just like any normal kid." Later in the article, it also says that the author of the book, and it doesn't actually say Eccles, but this is at the same time we know he's writing a book about Steven and is interviewing the family, that he's trying to set up a meeting between Steven and Parnell. Parnell is still in jail at the time, But this also bothered me. It doesn't happen because Parnell won't be interviewed or part of the book unless he gets some of the money, and he's refused. But that doesn't really seem to me like something that needed to happen for this book about Steven's life during the kidnapping. The only thing I read from this book was the introduction by Mike Eccles. And it also bothered me. There's just so many coincidences in how I met the Stayners. And then there are other things. We talked last episode about him telling the press that Parnell was going to be moving to Mendocino when it doesn't actually seem that that's going to be happening. And there are a bunch of times he's in the press for around similar things. He gets interviewed when there are big events. So the McMartin preschool thing with the Satanism, and when those people are found not guilty, he's in the press being upset because he thinks that people will be less vigilant. He's also a conspiracy theorist, and he's not just about this kind of stuff, but just in general, and he's in the press a lot for that.
You meaning Eccles? So he's like injecting himself into these stories.
That's how it feels to me.
To try to find another story that he can write a book about. The same with the Stayners.
Maybe, yeah, and maybe that's just me reading too much into some of this stuff. But I had to make a decision on whether or not I would use the book or not, and these are some of the reasons I chose not to. And he's an interesting guy. He'll come up again because he testifies in Cary Stayner's trial, and he's, based on what I've read, a big part of talking about how Cary Stayner's life was messed up and Cary Stayner's own views on Steven being kidnapped and having to live in that kind of environment where they're searching for Steven. Eccles dies in jail in 2003. He had been arrested in Monterey County for a parole violation. He'd actually been arrested 5 times in California, and he'd been held for disturbing the peace. At least 2 different times in confrontations with people, one on a public bus and one at the Fort Ord military installation, where he gets into fights with people and then exposes himself. He actually dies of a pulmonary embolism in jail. But I'd say one of the biggest things I read early on that guided my decision not to use the book was, more than anything, a lot of interviews had Steven saying he wasn't really happy with the way that his life was portrayed on screen in the movie. And we've mentioned this many times that he didn't want his life to be looked at as a horror story. And there's so much information available, so I just decided to go that direction instead of using the book. The truth is, highlighting Steven's life is difficult, and it's hard not to focus on awful things that happened to him. They probably weren't as easily compartmentalized as any victim hopes they would be. The normal stuff and the awful stuff all bleed together, because that's how people work. Steven had trouble when he came home, trying to build a new life, not losing who he was before, trying to heal and trying to grow up. When the movie finally came out in 1989, Steven Stayner did press. The ultimate reason Steven did interviews was because he hoped it might just reach, again, one child who needed help. And Steven is actually in the movie. He plays one of the police officers who escort his younger self to his house in Merced when he's found. In his own words, Steven did the movie for the same reason he continued to do interviews and a lot of things. Steven said, quote, "My biggest hope is that someone else is going to come home, even if it's just one child." A reporter for the Merced Sun-Star, who interviewed Steven many times and got to know him over the years, would tell the LA Times in an interview that the TV movie was a hard thing for him to go through, but that in many ways, once it aired, it was healthy. He lived those 9 years after coming home knowing there would be a movie, knowing that it was inevitable. So once it aired, it felt a lot like closure. It felt like the end of something, and he hoped he could move on from the demand of his story. And it sounds like this might have actually been possible. In the intervening years, once he's married, he does hear less from the press. So he's hoping that can continue after the movie's over. This movie is actually done by Lorimar Productions. So as we said, there's a lot of different stops and starts to things. They paid Steven $40,000 for the movie, and he gave a portion of that to his parents. Steven and Kay also shot a PSA that played at the end of the film. By the time the movie came out, Steven had been working with organizations like the Kevin Collins Foundation of San Francisco and talking about his story to children in schools. He had become even more dedicated to helping families of missing children, and he also testified at the state assembly on bills about fingerprinting and increasing the penalties for kidnapping. In 1989, Steven and his wife and 2 children are still living in Atwater, but they've moved into an apartment of their own. And by this time, Steven is working at Pizza Hut as a manager trainee, where his nickname among workers there was, quote, Hollywood. In an article in the LA Times in 1989, the owner of the restaurant said that, quote, he, as in Steven, was getting a feeling of accomplishment. He was evolving, developing a more outgoing personality and giving direction to others. Steven also cleaned office buildings to earn extra money and had hopes of someday becoming a police officer. In an interview with his family, he talked about trying to be a good father. He had difficulty letting his kids out of his sight when they were playing, but he was also afraid of passing on his fears to them, and he didn't want them to always be worried. His apartment was filled with children's books and toys, and he and his wife used most of the money he got from the film to pay off bills and fix a car. Life would change for Steven and the Stayner family once again in 1989. On Saturday, September 16, 1989, sometime before 5 p.m., Steven was leaving his job at Pizza Hut to head home. It was a rainy day and there were puddles everywhere. The manager of the Pizza Hut offered to let Steven take one of the company vehicles instead of his motorcycle. He thought it would be safer. Steven, whose motorcycle helmet had been stolen 2 months prior, refused. He had recently had his license suspended and was worried about the business and how it would affect Pizza Hut if he crashed one of their vehicles. At 4:55 p.m. on his way home on Santa Fe Road, between the cities of Atwater and Merced, a car pulled out from a side street and struck Steven's motorcycle. After hitting him, the car raced off from the scene. At 5:35 p.m. at Merced Community Medical Center, Steven was declared dead. The man who hit Steven was Antonio Loera, and he fled California and returned to Mexico. He would eventually turn himself into authorities in Tijuana, be brought back to Merced, and after pleading no contest to hit-and-run driving, would be sentenced to 90 days in jail and 12 months probation. At his funeral, Steven's sister, Cindy Stayner, lamented that she was, quote, waiting for the telephone to ring. Someone will say it's okay. Steve is here and he's alive because that's what happened before. In the back of Steven's funeral also sat some people he had become interconnected with. Jim, Angie, and Timothy White, now an adult, came to pay their respects one last time. On the lid of Steven's casket, a message was engraved, quote, going home. On August 28, 2010, a statue called the Steven Stayner and Missing Children Memorial was unveiled at the entrance of Applegate Park in Merced, California. The statue, created by Paula B. Slater, is a bronze statue featuring a life-size Steven Stayner and Timothy White and depicting the day he saved him. At the unveiling was Kay Stayner, Angie White, and many friends and family. Steven's daughter, now an adult, said of her father, quote, he really inspires me every day. I really aspire to be like him. It's not uncommon for people to note what an awful and tragic story Steven Stayner's life was. And that's not untrue. But I saw in many interviews that he wanted people to not just see a horror story, but the bigger truth. That in many ways his life was normal. I don't know Steven Stayner. All I have to go on are the many interviews he did, his own words. I'm sure they aren't complete, but I don't want to ignore his request to see him as more than a boy who was kidnapped. We could choose to see a boy who loved baseball, a boy who loved animals, a kid who hitchhiked just to see a movie, buy a comic book, or go to school. The kid who, legs outstretched, in the hallway of his Merced home, talked to girls on the phone. The man who worked multiple jobs to provide for his family. The man who never let his kids out of his sight, but worried about passing his fears on to them. Someone with family and friends he loved and cared for. These things matter as much as the bad ones. We could also remember the person who used his experience to try to help others. Wisely, he understood how many others have hurt as he had. He rarely turned down an interview, hoping he would reach just one child who needed help, and urged them to come forward, come home. He started the hard work of pulling down society's obstacles for victims of abuse. He stood up twice to his abuser, and for all the kids that might have been hurt by him had he not gone to jail. He continued to speak to children in schools in hopes his story might be the one to make a difference. Steven may have experienced a lot of tragedy, but his life wasn't tragic. He used it to help others, and we can follow his lead and continue to tear down stereotypes, stigmas, and myths that hurt and keep victims silent. Steven will never benefit from the work he started, but if we listen to his wishes and continue his work, thousands of children suffering from abuse can.